Well, military draft rules have changed just in time for the war in Iran. What exactly has happened? Here's the story from Fox 5 in Washington, D.C. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a measure to automatically register men for the Selective Service, updating requirements for the first time in decades. Oh, wow. Just as we're in war. Now, to be fair, they did pass this in December. So this was in the December NDAA, and the rule change goes into effect this coming December 2026. So starting in December of 2026, all males aged 18 to 25 years old, or really 26, will be automatically registered for Selective Service. Now, proponents of this say this will just make things easier. Don't you understand? This just makes things easier because before young men had to remember to register, and if they didn't, it was a felony. And although they never got prosecuted, but this will just speed things up and make things easier. It's just easier for them. That's what this is. And others say, yeah, right. You guys are just wanting to make sure that we've got a military force of pawns that you could throw at an enemy and sacrifice their lives so that you guys could continue siphoning off resources, making a gob of money, and you just need young poor men to go on the front lines. Okay, let's talk about how exactly this draft rule, what this has done. So before this coming December, the way it worked was there was no mandatory. It is mandatory to register for the Selective Service, but you had to go and physically do it, essentially. You had to either register online or you had to mail it in at the post office. Or there were ways that young men between 18 and 25 years old could register for Selective Service. You're mandated, if you're an American citizen, to register for Selective Service within 30 days of your 18th birthday. Anyone who arrives in this country between the ages of 18 and 26 must register within 30 days of arriving to the country if they're in that age range. So who has to do this is all male U.S. citizens and all male immigrants in that age bracket. And that includes, when they say immigrants, that's all immigrants. They're not just talking about legal ones. They're saying illegal immigrants, we don't care, you have to register for Selective Service. Could you imagine? I wonder how many illegal immigrants cross the border and say, well, now I got to follow the law and sign up for Selective Service so I can fight in the war. Asylum seekers also have to, refugees, permanent residents, everybody in that age range who's male, except I wonder how it works if you identify as female. Maybe you could get out of it that way. There might be a ton of sudden trans males coming up. Like we might see a lot of young men turn in female pretty quickly. So don't be shocked if we see skyrocketing rates of trans males, trans women. But there was a narrow group of exceptions, and one of those being, if you're a diplomat's kid, like I think Netanyahu's son doesn't have to do anything except sit on the beach and drink a bunch of mojitos, right, while they watch everybody in their country back in Israel have to go to war. Okay, so what Congress did was they then said, now we're going to make it just automatic registration. Previously, you would have to go and physically do it in some way. And then if there was a draft, then that would be run on a lottery system. And they would basically do it by birthday. They would have all the birthdays of the year, and then they would correlate those birthdays with certain numbers. And then they would draw a number out of the lottery, and that number corresponded with the set of birthdays. And those young men were called up for service, and that was automatic. They received induction notices. They had to go to war. When this happened in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, it was pretty much right away. They didn't wait until they ran out of soldiers. They didn't wait until, we all of the ones that volunteered are dead, so now we got to turn to the draft. No, it happens pretty quickly, so don't think, well, we'll wait and see, and once we see a bunch of American soldiers dying in Iran, then they're going to do the draft. No, they might do the draft on us pretty quickly. They might actually make it happen faster. And Trump will make it seem, well, I would say that the Trump supporters will say, he's just doing it to scare Iran because we want to show them that we can assemble a giant military. But don't be fooled. A lot of young men before Vietnam, before they were sent off to Vietnam, when they received their induction notices, a lot of them did a lot of pretty extreme things in order to avoid being shipped off to war. My dad was telling me about some of the things that some of his friends did. Like one guy paid a friend to hit his leg with a sledgehammer. Another looked at a bright light. I think it was, like at where they're looking at really bright lights. It's not the sun, but something else, like in a factory, and tried to make himself go blind in order to avoid service. So people do some pretty extreme things in order to avoid being sent off to war. And a person should not have to choose between their life or life imprisonment because their government, the oligarchs, the corrupt, greedy, money-making warmongers in Washington want to use them for cannon fodder. It should be a personal decision. But it, unfortunately, in many countries, it is not. And young men are viewed as pawns on a chessboard to be taken out in order to protect the king. Will we actually have a draft? That's the big question. And like I said, in Vietnam, they didn't wait until everybody died that volunteered. And so now we got to turn to you suckers. Sorry about that. We're just going to force it on you. Usually these drafts happen pretty quickly on. Here's Tucker Carlson talking about what could possibly implement and trigger a draft.
And what does it mean to win? Well, the most obvious and often repeated observation about this conflict is totally true. Iran's threshold for victory is very low. It just needs to survive. The regime has to remain intact. Now, in order to change the regime, everyone pretty much agrees you would need ground forces. You'd need troops, boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, in order to do that. And there is zero appetite for that in this administration, much less in the country. Israel would like us to commit ground troops, obviously, but it would take a lot to get us to do that. It would take some sort of terror attack in the United States, probably like 9/11, in order for us to do that. But that hasn't happened yet. We pray it never happens. So at this point, we're not going to commit ground troops, which does sort of put the whole exercise in perspective. If Iran's burgeoning nuclear program was really a threat to our core national security interests, then of course we would commit ground troops because any threat to our core national security interests merits committing ground troops. But this one didn't. And the people who decided this were told or believed somehow that we could effect regime change from the air, because Iran was in a pre-revolutionary stage, and all we needed to do was topple the head figure, like dominoes cascading. That would set off a chain reaction that installed a pro-Western government in Tehran. That was the argument. These arguments always seem ludicrous. In retrospect, you always laugh at them. Really? Did you really think that? Well, apparently we really did.
So Tucker thinks it would take a false flag or terrorist attack, one of the two, in order to get our leaders to want to implement a draft. And that's not far-fetched. That's certainly one of the ways. You could see, listening to Tucker, why they took him off of Fox News. This is why they took him off. He's too anti-war. He's like an anti-war liberal. So we got to get him off of Fox News. He would have completely swayed the audiences of Fox News against the war that Israel was implementing in Gaza, and certainly against this war in Iran. And so he had to be done away with and replaced with Jesse Waters, who just rah, 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 war, 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 all day, all day. And unfortunately, those Fox News audiences, many of them will just listen to whoever's put in front of them and agree with whoever's put in front of them. And what Fox News and all the warmongers and the military-industrial complex wanted to ensure was that the person in front of them was not anti-war Tucker Carlson. And that is why he's not on Fox News. Professor Zhang, he gives a new prediction that Trump will institute a military draft. And this is what he says the reason will be.
So let's look at some quick predictions. Okay. First prediction, of course, is that the U.S. will use ground troops, because using ground troops will create a national draft. And what does a national draft do? It creates a civil war, right? A lot of young people are going to refuse to fight in this war, and this is going to create protests. Then America will have no choice but to deploy the National Guard. And this will create the recipe for a lot of civil conflict in America. Okay? Another thing that will happen is, because you use ground troops, you will lose the war, and then CENTCOM, which is the American military in the Middle East, will then transfer over to Israel.
Okay. So he has a bit of a different theory on that one. He says, yes, there will be a draft implemented, but that draft implementation is not because we're actually going to use the soldiers in Iran. I mean, of course we will. We'll definitely do that. But it's going to kill two birds with one stone in that it's going to create civil unrest here in the United States because people will protest against a draft. And when there's that civil unrest and the National Guard is deployed onto the population, and you saw a taste of that with the ICE deployments in Minnesota, 2 Americans dead, and massive amount of civil unrest. Now, you think that level of civil unrest, you might have said, well, that was just a bunch of liberals who don't like to follow the law. I can't wait for Americans to keep on with that narrative when it's not illegals who've crossed into America who are, raping our children, which is what the narrative has been amongst those that wanted to get rid of all of the illegals in the country. Not saying they're wrong on wanting to remove people who are here illegally, but the narrative that they have is very hostile. Like, it's rather than just, well, we just want to make sure people follow the law. It's, we have to paint them into evil, like more evil than many of them really truly are. And that same narrative will be pushed on, but this time on Americans. It will be those young men who are draft dodgers. Ironically, Donald Trump is one, but they'll still say, oh, they're a bunch of draft dodgers. Look at those draft dodgers. They just need to get out there and fight for America. These are anti-Americans. They shouldn't even be citizens. They're so anti-American. But we have to throw them at a war. I mean, the narrative is going to become extremely hostile. And it's going to be hostile American against American. It won't be illegals against Americans. It'll be Americans against Americans. And the rhetoric will ramp up. And you'll see a lot of them bots online who are actually the IDF's, cyber units that are out there trying to stir this unrest and trying to get people to think that young men who don't want to serve in the war are evil anti-American, anti-Semites. And so he's saying that this will actually be used to foment the Civil War, that once the Civil War gets going, then, you're starting to implement Steve Bannon and Miriam Adelson and Alan Dershowitz's plan, which is to have Trump serve a third term. And that is really the only way to get a president into a third term. We do change presidents even during time of war. So war with Iran is not enough to keep a president in power. You would need a civil war. You would need something America hasn't seen. And they're trying to foment that here by using these tactics that both Tucker Carlson and now Professor Zhang have stated here. Now you might think, oh, that's crazy. Well, here is the Trump and Pete Hegseth being asked about this National Guard Quick Reaction Force, which is trained for crowd control and civil unrest. Watch this.
Secretary Hegseth, sir, a memo circulating on social media details the establishment of a National Guard response force that's going to be trained in crowd control and civil unrest and deployed in all 50 states by April of 2026. Can you verify the authenticity of that memo, and do you have any more information on the operations?
I'm not going to answer particulars on something that may be in the planning process, but we definitely do have multiple layers of National Guard response forces, whether it's in each state, whether it's regionally, whether it's Title 10 active duty, whether it's Washington, D.C. We've got a lot of different ways that constitutionally and legally we can employ Title 10 and Title 32 forces, and we will do so when necessary.
Okay, so they were asked this question around March 3rd, March 4th. That's when that was asked. And he was kind of vague on that. Well, we're not going to really specify. Well, now it has been confirmed. This is from the U.S. Department of War website. This was published March 10th. The 260th Special Purpose Brigade activated to strengthen security in the nation's capital. The District Columbia National Guard activated the 260th Special Purpose Brigade at the D.C. Armory March 7th. It is the only brigade in the Army specifically designed to coordinate military support to civil authorities and protect critical infrastructure in the nation's capital. So the goal is to support public safety operations and to strengthen coordination between military forces and civilian security partners in the district. So it is for activation on American soil is what that is for. So it's been confirmed that they do have these quick reaction force, these National Guard quick reaction forces ready to go to basically quell civil unrest. The good old days. Remember this?
My honest guidance to those young men, and I think their concerns are very legitimate, but if you're worried about the world spinning out of control, if you're worried about a military draft, if you're worried about, God forbid, a world war, the best way to prevent it is to vote for Donald Trump.
All of your sons and daughters will end up getting a draft notice, the thing called a draft. Dad, what's this? Oh, congratulations, you've been drafted into the military. You're going to fight a war against a country that nobody's ever heard of. Isn't it true? Isn't it ridiculous?
Yeah, it is actually ridiculous, Trump. And you are the president of the United States right now, and yet your administration is actively discussing a draft. That is what is being reported, that the White House is actively considering implementing a draft for this war. I would think, I would hope, but it's not the case, that Congress would have to declare war first before the president could enact a draft. But we haven't declared war since, what, 1941 or 42, something around then, right? World War II. And yet we implemented the draft for Vietnam, which apparently wasn't a war. Here's Lindsey Graham. He's not even, Lindsey Graham's pretending like he's going to ask.
Up to our allies, step up, get our air bases out of Spain. They're not reliable. Move all those airplanes to a country that would let us use them when we're threatened by a regime like Iran. To our friends in Spain, man, you have lost your way. I don't want to do business with you anymore. I want our air bases out of Spain into a country that will let us use them. To our Arab friends, I've tried to help you construct a new Mideast. You need to up your game here. I can't go to South Carolina and say we're fighting and you won't publicly fight. What you're doing behind the scenes, that has to stop. The double dealing of the Arab world when it comes to this stuff needs to end. I go back to South Carolina. I'm asking them to send their sons and daughters over to the Mideast. What I want you to do in the Mideast, to our friends in Saudi Arabia and other places, step forward and say, this is my fight too. I join America. I'm publicly involved in bringing this regime down. If you don't, you're making a great mistake and you're going to cut off the ability to have a better relationship with the United States. I say this as a friend.
Yeah, we're pretty sure you're the enemy. In fact, you seem like you're an enemy of the state. Kind of a traitor, actually, to the United States of America. Doing all the bidding for Israel and saying that you're going back to South Carolina and asking them to send their sons and daughters over to the Middle East, he says. We all know Lindsey Graham's not asking. We know that he's going to demand as he pressures the president into implementing a draft. That is what Lindsey Graham is going to be doing. And so there may come a time in the very near future where we do see a draft for this supposed non-war from the supposed non-war president, and yet here we are facing both of those realities right now. Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can catch Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, for free at KimIversonShow.com. See you there.